This is a quick look at what our setup looks like for the ISO testing. So basically what we need is some sort of a still life scene so that everything about what we're shooting is going to stay still, and we're going to get just the object in focus, and we're just going to be shooting it at different exposures based on the ISO. So we're going to look at manipulating 2 of the controls to keep the exposures equivalent, but keeping the f-stop the same. So let's look at our basic daylight exposure wheel really quick and look at kind of what that's going to look like as far as exposure goes. What we're going to want to do in the beginning is we're going to be setting it up so that we're using ISO 100 to start with. And then we'll be progressively increasing the ISO in order to see at what point do we really start to see a noticeable difference where we're starting to get some noise starting to happen in the picture. So we want to kind of find that workable range. So with our wheel here, right now we're set to ISO 100. And so what I'm going to do is I'm inside the classroom. I've got all the lights on. So we're going to be using, again, that interior kitchen. And so I'm just going to be adjusting the wheel by 8 stops. So I'm just going to move the wheel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so these are all of my correct exposures. So with that, I'm going to be starting with the first combination, which is 5.6 at 3. And so I'll go ahead and plug that into the camera and take my first exposure. Then for all the subsequent exposures, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to increase the ISO by 1 stop. So I'll go from 100 to 200. That will then in effect make my shutter speed slower, right? Because we've made the camera more sensitive to light. So in order to keep things balanced, we need to give it less time. So what I'll end up with is ISO 200 and a shutter speed of 6. That will then match up at 5.6. Okay. And let's get in there a little tighter so we can see. So the reason that that is going to work, and I could go all the way back over here and set this back up to, instead of 100, 200. And then I could offset the wheel by 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you'll see our 5.6 ends up matching up with 1/6 of a second. So instead of each time resetting the wheel to the next ISO setting and then counting up 8, well, there's no reason to necessarily do that. I can just increase the ISO and then also increase the shutter speed, because the bigger the shutter speed, the bigger the number, the faster that it is, the more it's going to cut that light. So we're just going to kind of go up 3 clicks and then up 3 clicks. So let's take a look at kind of what that looks like inside of our camera. So as I get ready to take my first picture, you should notice here my ISO is set to 100. And then I need to go ahead and plug in my f-stop and shutter speed combination. So I'm currently at f-stop 5.6, and then I wanted to make my shutter speed 1/3. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust this until I get to 1/3 of a second. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take my first picture just by clicking the shutter release. Now, once I've taken the first picture, I'm going to go ahead and increase ISO to 200 and then increase my shutter speed to 6. So in order to do that, I'm going to press the ISO button here on the back of the camera. So along here I've got menu, white balance, quality, ISO, and then the info button. So I'm going to hit ISO, and then while that is being pressed, you'll notice down here that it's lighting up in yellow, and I'm going to use the back dial to increase that to 200 by doing 3 clicks to the right. So now my ISO is set to 200, and then I just need to adjust my shutter speed from 1/3 of a second up to 6. So I'm just going to go 1, 2, 3, and then click my next exposure. Here we go. So now that we've taken our first picture, let's go ahead and move to the next exposure, and we're pulled in here a little bit tighter so you can see. So again, we're going to press this button here for ISO, and again it illuminates here in yellow, and then on our back commander dial we're just going to go 1, 2, 3 clicks. That moves us to ISO 400. then I'm going to release the ISO button, and I'm simply going to move the shutter control, which is the back commander dial, and I'm going to go 3 clicks as well. 1, 2, 3, and that moves me to a 1/13 of a second. And so I'll go ahead and take my next picture there. And then to go ahead and take the next picture, again, ISO, 1, 2, 3, and then shutter speed 1, 2, 3, and then click. And so I'm just going to kind of relatively quickly just go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now I'm at ISO 1600. Now I'm going to be at 3200. 1, 2, 3. And then I'm just going to keep going up. So the next one is going to be 6400 at 200. And then I'm going to go up to 12,800, and my shutter speed will become 400. And then our final exposure will bring that up to 1,000th of a second, and our ISO is going to go all the way up to 25,600, sorry, and take our last picture. So it's relatively straightforward as far as the shooting part goes. Once we're set up, it's just a matter of adjusting those exposures. And we should notice if we go through here, the exposure is staying the same. They're the same brightness throughout. It's just that our ISO and ISO and shutter speed are adjusting to keep the exposure equivalent. The f-stop staying the same, so our depth of field isn't changing. Visually, it should look the same in all of them. It's just in these last couple, as we get in here, we should notice that there's a jump in the noise that we start picking up as we start getting to those highest ISO numbers. Okay. Now let's look at what we need to do inside the computer once we've imported. Let's look at one other quick example of what if we weren't inside the classroom. So the example that I just did was for inside the classroom because I'm inside the classroom. But you might be in a different lighting condition. So the other condition that would be a good choice for this project would be to go ahead and shoot inside the shade. So again, if we start off at ISO 100, then we're going to offset the wheel by 3, right? 1, 2, 3. So these would be the correct exposures for my camera if I was in the shade. So in that case, I could choose 5.6 at 100, or I could choose f8 at 50. What really is most important is that we choose an f-stop where it's going to stay consistent and it's going to give us enough of a range to cover all of the stops. So we're going to be shooting 9 different pictures. So the shutter speeds are going to get faster and faster from wherever I start at. So 6400 is the fastest shutter speed that we can use on the camera. Sorry about that. So 6400. So I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I would want to at least start at a 25th of a second at f11 in order to ensure that I'm going to have enough movement to go along through here so that I don't have to change my f-stop. If I ran out of space, then the only way to keep giving it more light would be to open up the lens or close down the lens if I needed less light. So in this case, as long as I start as early as f11 and at 25th of a second, we should be okay. We should have enough shutter speeds to be able to get all the way over to here. If on the other hand I was just in the sun, well then I would start off at ISO 100, and then these would be our correct exposures. Again, if I'm going to need to get up to a 6400th of a second as I increase ISO, I need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I would have to shoot all the way up at f32. So if I zoom in a little bit to 50 millimeters or more on the camera, if I started at f32, then as I increase ISO to 200, I'd end up at a 50th of a second. And then as I go to ISO 400, I'd end up at a 100th of a second at f32. And so on, until I eventually got all the way over here to f32 at 6400. So with just a little bit of kind of thinking ahead, knowing that I need 9 stops to increase the ISO, because if we look here, we should see our camera has ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 16, 32, 64, 12, 800, and 25,600. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 stops worth of exposure latitude. So we need to make sure that when we go and set up our wheel that we've got at least the ability to move 9 stops so that we get the range that we need without having to modify or change any of those other combinations. And if I can keep the depth of field consistent, then again, it's easier to go ahead and compare the pictures at the end because they will all have a similar look to them. If the depth of field is changing and it's getting sharper or blurrier, then it might throw off my comparison of how the noise is looking. So we want to keep that as consistent as possible.